Chapter 23 of The Wonderful Adventures of Phra the Phoenician by Edwin Arnold. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The episodes I now relate are so strange, so nearly impossible, that I hesitate to set them down, lest you should call me untruthful and a jongleur. Nevertheless, they are told as they occurred, and you must believe them as you may. My quaint recluse had not been slain that night we tried his infernal engine, but had laid in a long swoon after I carried him from amid the wreck and debris of his den out into the moonlight. That swoon, indeed, lasted for a whole day and night, and Elizabeth wrung her white hands over her father's seeming lifeless body, while Emmanuel picked his yellow teeth reflectively with his dagger point at the couch foot, and Dame Marjorie spent all her art in unguents and salves upon the luckless inventor ere he showed signs of returning life. At last, however, he revived, and made a long, slow recovery of many days under the gentle ministering of his women, and while he throve hour by hour in the spring sunshine on the bench of his porch, I wooed his daughter in wayward, dissatisfied kind, and laughed scornfully at the black Spaniard's jealous scowls, and won the mellow heart of the old dame by my gallantness and courtesy. But it was child's play. I longed again to feel the hot pulse of keen emotions throbbing in my veins, to struggle with some strong tide of hot adventure, and so at last I had made up my mind to leave my good host and hostess at an early season, and, turning soldier again, espouse the first quarrel which chance threw in my way. Then one day it happened, a strange day indeed to me. Old Master Adam Faulkner had grown weary of his cranks and fan wheels, and had gone for solace to his dusty tomes and classics. Exploring amid them, in an eventful moment, he had taken down a missal penned by some old Saxon monk, and turned to a passage he must have known well, since it was marked and thumbed. And while the ancient scholar read and mumbled over that quaint black letter, with its gorgeous gold and crimson uncials, I, who chanced to stand a little way apart, saw the wan blood mount in a thin pink glow to the enthusiast's cheeks, and in that flush recognised that he was warm upon another quest. He mumbled and muttered to himself, and while he sauntered up and down, or stopped now and then to thumb and pore over that leathern volume, I caught, in disjointed fragments, some pieces of his thoughts. ' Ha ha ! A most likely find indeed, a splendid treasure house of trophies, and to think that no one but old Ambrose and I wot of it. Oh, what does he say? And in this place was destroyed a noble house, and the anger of the Lord fell on the pagan defenders, and they were slain one and all. Ah, God levelled their idolatrous dwelling places, and scattered their ashes to the four winds of heaven, and with them were destroyed, the common legend saith, all their hoards of brass and silver, all their accursed images of bronze and gold, all their trinkets and fine raiment, so that the vengeance of the Lord was complete and the heathen was utterly wiped out. Good, very good, Brother Ambrose, muttered the old man with chuckling pleasure. And now, where did this thing happen? This house, which harboured so much lewdness, stood on the hillock by the road, a few miles from the river, and had all that land which now is wholly perquisite to the neighbouring abbey. Good, good, for certain 'tis the very spot I thought of. A happy, happy chance that made me light upon this passage. I, who live so near the spot it speaks of. I, who alone of 1,000 can use it as the golden key to unlock such a sweet mine of relics as that buried pagan home must be. Oh, Ambrose, I am grateful. And patting the musty monkish tome in childish pleasure, he replaced it reverently upon its shelf. Then up and down he paced, the student's passion burning hot within him, muttering as he went, ' Why not to night ? Why not ? Why not ? There is no season better for such a work than soon, and I have my licence,' whereon he went to a peg on the wall and fumbled in the wallet of the ragged cloak I had seen him wear the night we met. In a minute out came a brand new scroll of parchment, neatly rolled and folded and stamped with the royal seal. That scroll Adam Faulkner undid, and setting his horn glasses on his nose, began to read the paper at arm's length with inarticulate sounds of rapture. It seemed to delight him so much that presently I sauntered over to share in the merriment, forgetting I had thus far been unobserved. But when we came within 2 paces of each other, the scholar, perceiving me with a cry of dismay, stuffed the crushed parchment hurriedly into his bosom, as though he thought himself about to be robbed of something precious by a sudden ambuscade. However, in a minute he recognised the robber and was reassured, yet undecided still, and inch by inch the white roll came forth, while the old man kept his eyes fixed on mine. What were his scrips and scrolls to me? I smiled to note the store he set by them. There was not one of those poor things could interest me more nearly than a last year's leaf from the garden yonder, and yet, strange to say, that white roll, creeping into light from under his rusty gabardine, did attract me somehow. Long life and strange experience have wakened in me senses dormant in other mortals, and I begin to be conscious of a knowledge beyond common knowing, a sense behind other senses, which grows with practice and seems ambitious by and by to bridge the gulf which separates tangible from unreal, and what is from what will be. That growing perspicacity within me smelt something of weight about Faulkener's writing more than usual, and with my curiosity gently roused, I queried, "That seems a scrip of value, sir. Is its interest particular or public?" "In some ways, good youth," Faulkener answered hesitatingly, as he unfolded the scroll so slowly as though he were jealous even of the prying sunshine. "In some ways the interest of what this is the key to is very general, and in other ways it is, at least for some time to come, most private." "Enough," I said, "and I am sorry to have questioned you, but your pleasure in the tome over there suggested just now that this was some general matter of curiosity, some dark passage in history whereon perhaps 2 minds might shed more light than one. I ask indulgence for intrusion." "Nay, but stop a minute. History, did you say? Why, this is history. This is the birth scrip of a brand new page in history. This is leave to turn a leaf no other fingers have ever turned, to spell out in sweet ashes and lovely fragments a whole chapter, perchance, of the bygone. Boy," cried the old fellow, grasping my arm with his lean fingers, and whispering in my ear as though he dreaded the grinning mummy of Pharaoh in the shadow might play eavesdropper, "can you keep a secret?" "Aye, fairly, when it does not interest me." "Why, then, there, take that and read it." And Faulkener thrust the roll into my hands and cast himself into an attitude, and crossed his arms upon his chest, and stared at me from under his shaggy eyebrows, as if he fancied to see fear and wonder and delight fly over my countenance, while my eyes devoured that precious deed of his. What was there so wonderful in it? The thing was sealed and tasselled, the ink and paper were new, the parchment white. It was, in fact, the very vellum Faulkener had been on his way to beg at court when we 2 met. A wonderful chance, as you shall presently see, an extraordinary hap indeed, that brought me to his side out of the great wastes of time at the very instant when that ancient scholar was on the road to ask that licence. But I did not know while I read how nearly the parchment touched me. It looked just like an ordinary missive from high authority to humble petitioner, profuse and verbose, signed and countersigned, and amid a wilderness of words, just a grain of sense that I construed as giving the bearer leave to seek for treasure on certain lands therein mentioned, and adopt the same to his proper pleasure, without tax or drawback. "This may be a golden key, sir," was my response as the thing was handed back, "but it is difficult to learn anything of the door it opens by looking on it." "Yet nevertheless, young man, it is a golden key, and you shall see me use it, for if, as yonder broken engine hints, the fates will that I may not pry into the misty future, yet with their leave, with the help of this and you, will I peep into the even more shadowy past. Were you ever at the opening of an ancient crypt, a stony hiding place, for instance, where dead men's bones lay all about mid dim gems and the rusty iron playthings of love and war?' ' I do recall one such an episode.' ' And did it not affect you greatly ?'' Greatly indeed.' ' Ay, boy, and this that I will show you shall affect you more. We two will turn a leaf which shall read as clear to you as though you had been at the writing of it 1,000 years before. It is a grassy hillock, and you shall lift that sod with me, and if this thing is as I think it is, oh, you shall start at what you find, and coward ague shall unstring your soldier legs. You shall be dumb with wonder, and ply your mattock with damp fearful awe beaded on your forehead, and starting eyes fixed fast in horrid pleasure on what we will unearth. Ay, if you have a spark of generous comprehension, if one drop of the milk of kindness still bides within you, you shall people this place we go to find with such teeming sprightly fancies, such moving mockeries of frail human kind new risen from their ashes at your feet, that you shall wring your hands out of pure rue for them that were, and pluck your beard in dumb chagrin, and beat upon your heart even to watch all that which once was ruddy valour and hot love and white beauty go a-drifting so upon the dusty evening wind. You will come with me?' ' Old man,' I said, pacing up and down with folded arms and bent head, ''twas upon my tongue to say I would not. I had a fair tryst to keep this evening, and something that I have seen of late makes such ventures as you have planned doubly distasteful to me. 'Twas in my mind to laugh and shake my head, but, gods, you have stirred a pulse within me that rouses me with resistless wonder. Your words tell on me strangely. There is something in that you say which echoes through my heart like the footfall of a storm upon the hollow earth, and I can do nothing but listen and acquiesce. I will come.' ' Good youth, I knew you would. And that our hopes may not suffer by delay, let us prepare at once. Get you mattock, spade, and pick with whatever other tools your strength shall need, and I will feed and have my pretty palfrey saddled, and con yon crabbed passage over once again. So we will be ready, and at nightfall under the yellow stars we'll start upon a venture that you shall think on for many a day.' I bent my head, and we did as Faulkener suggested, but a strange unrest possessed me. When spade and mattock were hidden where we could take them up in secret, for we did not wish our enterprise too widely known, the time hung wondrously heavy on hand. All the tedious hours before sunset I was oppressed with an anxiety quaint and inexplicable, half wishing by turns I had not promised to join the mad old fellow in his moonlight quest, and then laughing my scruples down and becoming as restless for the start as before I had been reluctant. As for the scholar himself, the very shirt of Deianira possessed him, and his impatience shone behind his yellow wrinkled face like a candle inside a horn lantern. Somehow the hours wore through, however, and when the evening was come we set forth, Faulkener pale and eloquently raving from astride of that mean palfrey, whose sumpter pad was loaded with our tools on one side, and on the other a monster sack wherein to bring back all the treasure we were to rifle, and I on foot, leading that gentle beast, and thoughtful past proportion or reason. At first we pushed on at a brisk pace, by familiar roads, but after a time our path lay more to the eastward, the scholar said, and once off the broad white track leading to the nearest town, the road grew narrower and more narrow. On we went in silence, mile after mile, by rutty lanes where twittering bats flitted up and down the black arcades of overhanging bush and briar, by rushy flats where the water stood wan and dim in the uncertain light, now brushing by the heavy dew-laden branches of a woodman's path through deep thickets of oak and beech, and then following a winding sheep-track over ling and gorse. So sombre was that way, and so few the signs of life, I wondered how the scholar kept even the direction, but he was a better pilot than he seemed, and while he ranted silently upon the sky and waved his hands in ghostly rhythm to his unspoken thoughts, I found from a chance word or two he was in some kind watching the stars, and leading us forward by their dim light towards that goal whereof he had got knowledge from his musty tomes. On we went through the still starry night, pacing along from black shadows to black shadows, and moonlight to silver moonlight, until it must have been within an hour or two of daybreaking, for under the purple pall of sky there was a long stream of pale light in the east. It was about that time, and the night shadows were strong and ebony, and the cold breath and deep hush of a coming morning hung over everything, when Faulkener first began to hesitate, and presently confessed that which he sought for should be somewhere here. But in the glimmer of the starlight he was uncertain whether it lay to right or left. We halted, and mounting on a hillock, peered all about us, but to little purpose, for the sombre night hid everything. The massed forest trees rose tier upon tier on every hand, like mountain ranges running on indefinite into the gloomy passes of the clouds, and the chance gleams of moonlight, lying white and still upon the dew-damp meadows, were so like great misty lakes and rivers, it were difficult to say whether they were such or no. So back we scrambled once more, and unhitched our patient beast from the hazel whereto we had tied him, and plunged on again by dingle and sandy road, and rough woodland path, until we were hopelessly mazed, and there seemed nothing for it but to wait till daylight, or go empty back. Yet, reluctant to do either, we held to it a little, hoping some chance might favour us. 'Twas past midnight. Not a crow of distant cock or yelp of village cur broke the dead stillness, and we were plodding down a turfy road, when, on a sudden, our patient steed threw forward his ears and came to a dead stop, and, almost the same minute, the grey-clad figure of a countryman in long cape and hood, a wide slouch hat upon his head, and a tall staff in his hand, came out from the depth 100 yards ahead of us, and with slow measured gait and bent face walked down towards us. Old Faulkener was overjoyed. Here was one who knew the country and would show us his precious hillock, and he shouted to that stranger and tugged his palfrey's rein. But that observant beast was strangely reluctant. He went on a pace, then stopped, and backed and pawed the silent ground, throwing his prick ears forward, whinnying and staring at that silent coming stranger with strange disquiet in every movement, and I sympathised with that dumb brute, and as the countryman came near, somehow my blood ran cold and colder, my tongue, that was a wag to ask the way, stuck helpless to my teeth, a foolish chill beset my limbs, and by the time we met I had only wit enough left to stare speechless at that grey form in silent expectation. But the old philosopher did not feel these tremors. He was delighted at our good luck, and fumbling in his wallet pulled out a small silver piece, which he tendered to the man, explaining at the same time our need and asking him to guide us. The stranger took the coin in silence, and, keeping his face hidden in the shadow of his hat, said the mound was near. He knew it well, he had bided by it long, and he would willingly show us where it lay. Back we went by copse and heather, back for 1/2 mile, then turned to the right, and in a few minutes more came out of the brushwood into the starlight, and there, at our very feet, the ground was swelling up in gentle sweep to the flat top of a little island hill lost in the sea of forest land about it. It was the place we came for, and the scholar, without another thought for us, joyfully pricked his steed to the rise, and was soon out of sight round the shoulder of the ground. But oh, what was that strange dull hesitation that made my feet heavy as lead upon that threshold? Whence came those thronging formless fancies that crowded to my mind as I surveyed that smoothly rounded hillock and all the fantastic shadows beyond it? That spot was the same one I had wandered to when I walked lonely from Faulkener's house, and here chance brought me to it anew at dead midnight, and all the old thrills of indistinct remembrance I then had felt were working in me again with redoubled force, moving my soul to such unrest that I bent my head and hid my eyes, and strove long, but vainly, to recall why or when I had last trodden that soil, as somewhere and somehow I was certain that I had. Thinking and thinking without purpose, presently I looked up, and there, 2 paces away, was still that grey hedgeman leaning on his staff and regarding me from under his country hat with calm, soulless attention. I had forgotten his presence, and it was so strange to see him there, so rustic and so stately, that I started back, and an unfamiliar chill beset me for an instant. But it was only a moment. Then, angry to have been surprised, I turned haughtily upon him, and with folded arms, in mockingness of his own stern attitude, stared proudly into those black shadows where should have been his face. Jove! 'Twas a stare that would not have blanched for all the lightning in a Caesar's eye, or wavered one moment beneath the grim returning gaze of any tyrant that ever lived. And yet, even as I looked into that void, my soul turned to water, and my eyelids quivered and bent and drooped, my arms fell loose and nerveless to my side, and every power of free action forsook me. That being took my perturbation with the same cold lack of wonder he had shown throughout. He eyed me for a minute with his sleepy, stately calm, and then he said, "You have been here before?" "Yes," I answered, "but how or when only the great gods know. And though I noticed it not at the moment, yet since it has flashed upon me as another link in a wondrous chain, that at that moment both I and the grey countryman were using the long-forgotten British tongue. And would you know, would you recall?" he queried in his passionless voice. "Aye, if it is within your power to stir my memory, stir it, in the name of loud Tyrannus, of old Belenus, and all the other fiends I once believed in." "Well sworn, Phoenician," said that tall nocturnal wanderer, and without another word grasped his staff, and signing me to follow, led round the shoulder of the hillock to where, alone and solitary, we two were stayed by a trickling rivulet that sprang from a grassy basin in the slope, and went by a little rushy course winding down into the dusty thickets beyond. At that pool my guide stopped suddenly, then, pointing with stern finger still shrouded under the folds of his ample cloak, "Drink," he cried, "drink, and remember." I could no more have thwarted him than I could have torn that solid mound from off its base, and down I went upon one knee, and took a broken crock some shepherd had left behind, and filled it and put it to my lips and drank. Then up I leapt with a wild yell of wonder and astonishment, while right across the sullen midnight sky, it seemed, there shot out in one broad living picture all the painted pageantry of my Roman life. I saw old Roman Britain rise before me, and the quaint templed towns of a splendid epoch leap into shape from the tumbled chaos of the evening clouds. I saw the crowded episodes that had followed after my rewakening in the cave where my princess had laid me. The faces of my jolly long-dead comrades seemed thronging round about me. I heard the street cries of a Roman British city. I saw the dust rise and the glitter, and the phalanges wheeled and turned upon the castra before the porch, where a gay patrician gallant I lounged in gold and turquoise armour. I saw Electra's ivory villa start into form and substance out of the pale, filtering Tudor moonlight, and the great white bull and the haughty lady, stately and tall, beckoning me up her marble steps. And then I was with her, her petted youth, lying indolent and happy, toying disdainfully with the imperial love she proffered me, while we filled our rainbow shells from that bright fountain that spurted in her inner court. With a wild cry I dropped the shepherd's crock and started back. The water I was sipping was the water of Electra's courtyard fountain. Gods, there was none other like it. Often we two had drunk of that crystal torrent as it burst, full of those sweet earth salts the Romans loved so well, from the bowels of the earth straight into her pearly basins. The last time I had stooped to it was on that night of fiery combat when Electra's villa fell, and here I was sipping of it again, so strangely and unexpectedly that I hid my eyes a space, scarce knowing what might happen next. When I uncovered them, the black dusky clouds had swallowed the painted pageantry of my vision, the night wind blew chill round the grassy slope, the Roman villa and fountain had gone from the grey shadows where we stood, only the tinkle of the falling water was left in the darkness, and in front of me still the tall figure of that grey-clad countryman. Only that countryman. Hoth, how can I describe the rush of keen wonder and fear which swept over me when, looking at him again, I saw that he had turned back the flap of his wide hat, and there in the dead grey light was staring at me the same stern, passionless face that had come to my shoulder in the reek and heat of combat on this very spot 1300 years before, and, doing the bidding of the great unknown, had drawn me from those fiery shambles only just in time. I knew him then, on the instant, as no mortal, and glared at him with every nerve at tension, and speechless tongue, too numb to question, and while I stared like that with the strong emotion playing on lip and eye, it was only a minute or so, though it seemed an epoch, the face of that being was lit by a smile, sedate and impalpable. Then, turning to me with gentle superiority, he said, "You have been long, Phoenician. They told me you would come again, and I have waited for you here these few hundred years, waited until I near tired of watching all your circling vagaries. Here is the place you came tonight to find. My errand ends. Dig, wonder, and reflect. This I was told to show you and to say." And like the echo of his own words, like the shadow of a cloud upon a rock, that strange messenger of another life was drunk up by the darkness right in front of my wondering eyes. So swift and silent was his passage back into the outer vagueness that for a minute I could not believe that he had gone in truth, and held my breath and stared up and down, expecting he would fashion again out of the draughty air, or speak above or below once more in that voice every syllable of which fell clear on my soul like water falling in a well. But it was useless to listen and peer into the gloom. The shape was gone beyond recall, and while my mind still pondered over the strangeness of it, keeping me spellbound at the brink of that enchanted fountain, with bent head and folded arms, trying to guess how much of this was fantasy and how much fact, there rose a shout upon the still night air, and raising my eyes, there was Faulkener's quaint black image, capering wildly on the dusky skyline, the while he brandished aloft in one hand a spade, and in the other, looking quaintly like a new severed head dangling by the hair, the first sod he had cut of that treasure heap so dear and dreadful to me. I went sullenly up to the recluse, full of such strange conflicting feelings as you may suppose, and found him eager and excited. He had marked out a long furrow across the crest of the hill, and this we were to open and strike out right or left according as our venture throve. Jove! I stared for a time at that black trench as though it were the narrow lip of hell, which presently should yawn and throw up a grim, ghostly, warlike crew, worse than those who frightened Jason. And then I laughed in bitterness and perplexity, and tore off my doublet and rolled my tunic sleeves above my shoulder, and took a spade, and at one strong heave plunged it deep into the tender bosom of the swelling turf just over where the outskirts of the ancient Roman house had been, and wrenched it up. Then in again, then again, while the mad philosopher capered in the twilight to watch my sinewy strength so well applied, and the whistling bats swept curious round us. I had not turned back a stitch of that light peaty coverlet when down my spade sank through an inner crust, deep into something soft and hollow seeming, and the next minute Faulkener, who also had set to work, was in the same fine strata too. We laid it bare, and there below us shone, a floor of white dim ashes mixed with earth and leaves and roots. "A torch! A torch!" yelled Faulkner, and down he went upon his knees, and, wild with exultation, wallowed in that powdery stuff, throwing it out by hand and armfuls, till all his clothes were covered with it, and his hoary beard was still more hoary, and his white face still more white, and his mad twinkling eyes were still more lunatic, and I helping him, full of crowding hopes and fears. And so we dug and grovelled and scraped, while the pale stars twinkled overhead, until soon my master gave a shout, and, looking quickly at him, Jove, he was hand in hand with a dead white hand that he had uncovered, and was hauling at it in frantic eagerness, and scraping away the rubbish above, and slipping and plunging and staggering in the grey dust, while the beaded sweat shone upon his forehead, and his white elf locks were all astray upon the night air. And then, gods, it began to give, and I held my breath, knowing all I knew, while the white stuff cracked and heaved about that ghostly palm, and then it opened, and first his head, and then his shoulders, and then his stiff contorted limbs, my master dragged out into the starshine, with one strong effort, a bulky ancient warrior. There, in the torchlight which Faulkner held above him, slept that kiln-dried soldier. He lay flat upon his back, and while one knotted shrivelled fist was stretched stiff in front in deathless anger, the broken digits of his other hand were welded by red iron rust about the red rusty hilt of a bladeless sword, and that soldier's soulless face was set stiff and hard, while on his stern shut lips and deep in his eyeless sockets even now restless passion and quenchless hate seemed smouldering. About that frail body still clung in melancholy tatters the shreds and remnants of purple webs and golden tissue. On his shoulders, sunk into his withered lifeless flesh, were the mouldy straps and scales of harness and cuirass, and on his head what once had been, though now it was more like winter wrack, a gay helmet and a horseman's nodding crimson plume. It was a ghostly plaything to unearth like that under the wavering starlight, and it was doubly dreadful to note how deathlike was it, while yet all the hot life-passion lay stamped for ever in unchanging fierceness on the hideous mask of dissolution. I turned away as Faulkner, gleefully shouting that he was 1,000 years old if he was a day, tore the russet trophies from him and pushed him down the hill. I turned away, grimly frowning, out into the black starlight with folded arms, for that contorted thing was jolly Caius Marcius, my merry Byzantine captain of those mercenaries who stood it out with me that last night of Roman power in England. Jolly Caius Marcius! Often we two had set the British dogs a-yelping as we wandered home from noisy midnight frolics down the moonlit Temple streets. Often we two had driven the same boar to bay deep in his reedy stronghold. Often at banquet and at feast, when the roses lay deep below and the strong warm breath of scented wine hung thick above, that curly black head the Mercian damsels liked so well had sunk happy and heavy on my shoulder. Jove, how the world had spun since then, and there was Faulkner pushing him down the slope, and I could not raise a comrade finger for merry Caius, and could only stupidly remember, as the sprawling heap went trundling away into the brambles, how in that long ago I had owed him half a silver talent and had never yet repaid it. Well, we fell to work again, and farther on, amid the passages where these ancient men had fought and fallen in the rout, we found a limb, and dug about it till we uncovered another strange twisted hide of what was once humanity. A stalwart shell, this one, but Faulkner thought little on him, because he wore no links or chains, and set him rolling after the other with scant ceremony. The next we came to seemed by gear and weapons a southern mercenary. He lay asprawl upon his face, and my master levered him out and plucked him of his scanty metal relics with no more compunction than if he were a pigeon. It was grim, wild work, there under the leer of the yellow dawning, all in the hush of the twilight, coming on those ghastly relics thus one by one, and prizing them out of their ashy shells, and turning them over, and reading on each black mummy mask, that seemed to smile and grin with dead ferocity under the flickering flambeau light, the countenance and fashion of ancient comrade and ally. And ever and anon as I worked, held to the labour by a strange fascination, the melancholy footfall of the gusty wind came pacing round the hill, and with a frown and start I would look over my shoulder, half fearing, half hoping it was my grey countryman come once more. So we toiled and toiled while the light waned, and Faulkner's treasure heap was swelling, and the nearer we worked to the centre of that ample round of corridors and courts, the thicker came to light those old world fighters, and presently we got right down to the tessellated paving of Electra's lordly hall, and here we found what it was which made all those ancient warriors so still and lasting. It was that strange, mysterious fountain, that jet of pungent taste and wondrous properties, when the walls fell in, had overflowed its basins and percolated through the deep soft ashes lying thick about these marble rooms and chambers, and by the stony magic wherewith it was charged, had lined and filled those ancient gentlemen it met with, and thereafter, in long dark months of silence, had supplemented their wasting tissues with its calcareous sediment, and kept them for ever as we found them, strange, horrible, exact, and real, with passion and life stamped deep on every face, and strength and vigour in every limb, although those faces wore only ashy masks, and those limbs no stouter than the vellum on which I write. Under that crust of welded stone and ashes it was wonderful to see how perfectly was everything preserved. We raised it in great flakes from the stony flooring, and all the stain and litter of the fight lay under it, as though they were not a dozen hours old. We chipped that scaly covering from the walls, and there, fresh as the moment they were made, gleamed up under our wavering torchlight all the gay mural paintings, the smudges of battle and the scars of axe and arrow. We lifted that pale stiff shroud from the inner chambers, and beneath lay shreds and shells of furniture and gear. The half-baked loaves were in the oven, the flesher's knife was on the block. Round about the bounds of that stately ruin we went, uncovering at every spadeful something mournful, forgetting fatigue and time as wonder after wonder rose to view. Thus we came at last to the mid-court where the great fight had been, and peeled the thin turf from off it, far and near. We had scarce begun to rake aside the ashes when down to help us came, out of the black parting clouds, strong gusts of cold morning wind, blowing fitfully at first and chill, and sobbing overhead, and all about us, as though the grey air was full of spirits. It gathered strength, and, wailing over the wide floor we had uncovered, in one strong breath swept back the veil of ashes, and there, Jove, all amid the juts of fallen masonry and stumps of beam and rafter, blackened in that fire which seemed but yesterday, were high protruding knees of dead combatants, and stiff bent elbows as thick as grass, and haggard wizened faces all stamped with 20 fine degrees of terror, and fierce clenched fists, and hands that still waved above them broken hilt and blade. There they lay in heaps and rucks about that ancient villa floor, just as they had died fighting amid the red choking ashes of the blazing roof, all horribly lifelike and yet so grimly dead. Old Faulkner yelled in sheer affright and capered, and shook his fist towards them, and tore his lean white locks 'tween dread and wonder, and stiff my Phrygian curls seemed on my head, and cold the sweat upon my forehead. And then, while we watched, a very wonderful thing happened, and dreadful and beautiful, those cinders began to glow. Jutting beam and rafter grew red and redder, pile and timber and cornice caught the ambient blush, the crimson stain crept all across the hall, it burnt in mockery upon ruined wall and portico, and lit with an unearthly radiance those parched, contorted faces that grinned and leered and frowned, still in frantic struggle with their kind, all round us. Was I mad? Was this some hideous last delusion which beset my aching mind and horror-surfeited eyes? No, there was Faulkner saw it too, and had fallen on his knees and buried his fearful face behind his hands, and thrown his gabardine cloak over his head to shut out that dreadful sight. I drew my hand across my face and looked again. It was true, too true. That charred and ancient villa was all alight once more. Wherever fire had been, at every point and crevice, there the ambient glow was smouldering with a flameless brightness. It underlay the silver ashes with a hot golden shine. It gilded all the fallen metal statues of gods and goddesses until they seemed to shimmer beneath its touch. It shone near by under the walls and far out upon the steps. It was so real, so terribly like what it had been here 1,000 years before, that I half bent to take a weapon in the delusion of that brilliant fantasy. A husky cry of encouragement to those stark ancient warriors half framed itself upon my lips, and then, how exactly I know not, but somehow a slight insequence flashed upon me, and in another minute I had spun angrily round upon my heel, and there I saw, right behind us, calm, benignant, crimson, the great May sun was topping the eastern oak trees. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Wonderful Adventures of Phra the Phoenician by Edwin Lester Arnold. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After that eventful episode just detailed, life ran smooth and uneventful for a time in the old manor house. I had had enough to think of for many a day, and was inert and listless somehow. War, that had seemed so bright, had lost half its colour to me. Honour and renown, why, the green grass in the fields was not more fleeting, I began to think. And what use was it striving after conquests which another age undid, or attempting brave adventures whereof a later time recognised neither cause nor purpose? I was in a doleful mood, as you will see, and lay about on Faulkner's sunny red brick terraces for days together, reflecting in this idle fashion, or pressed my suit upon his daughter when other pastimes failed. Now this latter was a dangerous sport for one like me, and one whose fair opponent at the game had such a fine untaught instinct for it as Mistress Bess possessed. I began to speak soft things into that lady's ear, as you may remember, like many another, for lack of better occupation, and because it seemed so discourteous to be indifferent to the sweet enticement of my friend, and then I took the gentle malady from her, and growing worse than she had been, how could she do aught but sympathise? And so, between us, we eked the matter on in ample leisure, until that which was a pretty jest became at last very serious and sober earnest. It was a strange wooing. I still worked in the forge, riveting, hammering, and piecing together the fragments of the scholar's shattered dream, and down the damsel would come at times into the grimy den, and sit upon the forge corner in her dainty country smock, twirling her ribboned points and laughing at me and my toil, as fresh and dainty among all that gloomy black litter round about as a ray of spring sunshine. I was so solitary and glum, how could I fail to be pleasured in that dear presence? And one time I would hammer her a gleaming buckle or wristlet out of a knob of ancient silver, and it was sweet to see that country damsel's eagerness, as, with flushed face and sparkling eyes, she bent over and watched the pretty toy shine and glitter, and take form and shape under my cunning hammer. Or then again, perhaps, another day I would tell her, as though it were only hearsay, some wondrous old story of the ancient time, so full of light and colour and love as I could fill it, and that dear auditor would drink in every syllable with thirsty ears, and laugh and weep and fear and tremble just as I willed, the while I pointed my periods with my anvil irons, and danced my visionary puppets against the black shadows of that nether hall. Hoth, a good listener is a sweet solace to him whose heart is full. Those narratives did so engross us that often the forge went cold, and bar and rivet slumbered into blackness, while I stalked up and down that dingy cavern, peopling it with such glowing forms and fancies as kept that dear untutored damsel spellbound. Often the evening fell upon us so, and we had at last to steal shamefacedly across the courtyard to where the warm glow behind the lattices told us supper and the others waited. There was small difference in these days. I hammered cheerful and I hammered dull, I hammered hopeful and I hammered melancholy. I hammered in tune to the merry prattle of that girl, and I hammered sad and solitary, and ever, as I forged and welded by myself, you may guess how I thought and speculated, thought of all the love that I had loved, and all the useless strife and ambition, and now hung over my blackening iron as the pain of ancient perplexities and disappointments beset me, and then anon laughed and beat new life into the glowing metal as the light of forgotten joys flashed for a moment on the fitful current of my mind. Ah, and again I forged hot and impetuous on my master's rods and rivets, as the old pulse of battles and onset swelled in my veins, forged and hammered while the stream of such fancies bore me on, until, unwitting, the very molten stuff beneath my hands took form and fashion of my thoughts, and grew up into shining spearheads and white blades, until the fantasy in turn was past, and I checked my fancies and saw, ashamed, the foolish work my busy hammer had fashioned, and sadly broke the spearheads and snapped the blades, and came back with a sigh to meaner things. My mind being thus full of all those wild adventures and wondrous exploits I had seen and shared, when, as I was strolling one idle morning down Faulkner's dusty museum corridor, and sampling as I went his precious tomes, that thing happened to which you owe this book. I dipped into his missals and vellums as I sauntered from shelf to shelf, and soon I found there was scarcely a page, scarcely a passage within their mothy leathern covers that did not touch me nearly, or set me thinking of something old and wonderful. There was not a page in all that fingered, scholar-marked library, it seemed to me, upon which I could not find something better or nearer to the shining truth to say than they who had wrote those cupboard histories and philosophies. And first I was only sad to see so much inaccurate set down, and then I fell to sighing as I turned the leaves of quaint treatise and pedantic monkish diary, that they should write who knew so little, and I, who knew so much, should be so dumb. And thus vague fancies began to form within my mind, and, backed by the brooding memories, strong within, began to egg me on to write myself. Jove, I had not touched a pen for many 100 years, and yet here was the budding hunger for expression rising strong within me, and I laughed and went over to old Faulkner's great oak table by the mullioned window, and took up his quill and turned it here and there, and looked on both ends of it, then presently set it down with a shake of the head as a weapon past my wielding. I felt the texture of his vellums, and peered into the depth of his ink-pot, as though they were to see therein all those glowing facts and fancies that I yearned to draw therefrom. But it would not do, not even the challenge of those piled tomes, not even the handy means to the end I coveted, could for a time break down my diffidence. So I fell melancholy again, and wandered down that quaintly stocked museum library, gazing ruefully on each sad remnant of humanity, and thinking how quaint it was that I should come to dust my kinsmen's skulls and tabulate those grim old heads that had so often wagged in praise of me. Then back again to the shelves, and pored and pondered over the many authored books, until, by hap, my eyes lit upon a passage in an Eastern tale that was so pregnant with experience, so fine, it seemed to my mood in fancy and philosophy, that it entranced me and fired my zeal to a point naught else had done. The ancient Arabian narrator is telling how one came, in mid-desert, upon a splendid ruined city, a silent, unpeopled town of voiceless palaces and temples, and wandered on by empty street and fallen greatness, until, in the stateliest court of 1,000 stately palaces, he found an iron tablet, and on it was written these words: In the name of God, the Eternal, the Everlasting, throughout all ages. In the name of God, who begetteth not, and who is not begotten, and unto whom there is none like. In the name of God, the mighty and powerful. In the name of the living, who dieth not. O thou who arrivest at this place, be admonished by the misfortunes and calamities that thou beholdest, and be not deceived by the world and its beauty, and its falsity and calumny, and its fallacy and finery. For it is a flatterer, a cheat, a traitor. Its things are borrowed, and it will take the loan from the borrower, and it is like the confused visions of the sleeper and the dream of the dreamer. These are the characteristics of the world. Confide not, therefore, in it, nor incline to it, for it will betray him who dependeth upon it, and who in his affairs relieth upon it. Fall not into its snares, nor cling to its skirts, for I possessed 4,000 bay horses in a stable, and I married 1,000 damsels, all daughters of kings, high-bosomed virgins like moons. And I was blessed with 1,000 children, and I lived 1,000 years, happy in mind and heart. And I amassed riches, such as the kings of the earth were unable to procure, and I imagined that my enjoyments would continue without failure. But I was not aware when there alighted among us the terminator of delights, the separator of companions, the desolator of abodes, the ravager of inhabited mansions, the destroyer of the great and the small, and the infants and the children and the mothers. We had resided in this palace in security until the event decreed by the Lord of all creatures, the Lord of the heavens and the Lord of the earths, befell us, and the thunder of the manifest truth assailed us, and there died of us every day 2, till a great company of us had perished. So when I saw that destruction had entered our dwellings, and had alighted among us, and drowned us in the sea of deaths, I summoned a writer, and ordered him to write these verses and admonitions and lessons, and caused them to be engraved upon these doors and tablets and tombs. I had an army comprising 1,000 bridles, composed of hardy men with spears and coats of mail and sharp swords and strong arms, and I ordered them to clothe themselves with the long coats of mail, and to hang on the keen swords, and to place in rest the terrible lances, and mount the high-blooded horses. Then, when the event appointed by the Lord of all creatures, the Lord of the earth and the heavens, befell us, I said, O companies of troops and soldiers, can ye prevent that which hath befallen me from the mighty King? But the soldiers and troops were unable to do so, and they said, How shall we contend against him from whom none hath secluded the Lord of the door that hath no doorkeeper? So I said, Bring to me the wealth. And it was contained in 1,000 pits, in each of which were 1,000 hundredweights of red gold. And in them were varieties of pearls and jewels, and there was the like quantity of white silver, with treasures such as the kings of the earth were unable to procure. And they did so, and when they had brought the wealth before me, I said to them, Can ye deliver me by means of all these riches? and purchase for me therewith one day during which I may remain alive.' But they could not do so. They resigned themselves to destiny, and I submitted to God with patient endurance of fate and affliction until He took my soul and made me to dwell in my grave. And if thou ask concerning my name, I am Kush, the son of Sheddad, the son of Ad the Greater." "Oh, well written!" I cried. "Well written, Kush, the son of Sheddad, the son of Ad the Greater, well and wisely written, and also I will write, for I have much to tell, and I too may some day be as thou art." Thus was the beginning of this book. I got pen and ink and a volume of unwritten leaves forthwith, and carried them away to a lonely chamber in the thickness of a turret wall, a little forgotten cell some 6 poor feet across. And there solitary I have written, and still write, peopling by the flickering yellow lamplight that stony niche with all the brilliant memories that I harbour, letting my recollection wander unshackled down the wondrous path that I have come, and step, by episodes of pain and pleasure, by wild adventure and strange mischance, down, far down, from the ancient times I have brought you until now, when my ink is still wet upon the events of yesterday, and I cease for the moment. This, then, is all that there is to say, all but one suggestive line. I and yonder fair damsel have plighted troth under the apple trees out in her orchard. We have broken a ring, and she has one half of it, and I have the other. To-morrow will we tell her father, and presently be married. 'Tis a right sweet and winsome maid, and together, hand in hand, we will rehabilitate this ancient pile, and dock that desert garden, and get us friends and troops of curly-headed children, and lie and bask i' the jolly sunshine of contentment, and so go hand in hand for ever down the pleasant ways of peaceful dalliance. Jove! My pen and a few poor minutes more from the bottom dregs of life. It is over. All the long combat and turmoil, all the success and disappointment, all the hoping and fearing. That which I thought was a beginning turns out to be but an ending. My hand shakes as I write, my life throbs, and my blood is on fire within me. I am dying, friendless and alone as I have lived, dying in a niche in the wall with my great unfinished diary before me, and with the grim briefness of my necessity. This is how it has happened. I had wooed and won Elizabeth Faulkner, and, on the day after she had come down into the forge, as was her wont, sweet and virginal, and I was there at work and took her into my arms. And while we dallied thus, there entered on us the ancient scholar and the swart steward. Gods, that villain blanched and scowled to see us so, till his swart face was whiter than the furnace ashes. I took the maiden's hand, and boldly turning to her father, told my love and its accomplishment, whereat she burst from me and threw herself upon his bosom, and, radiant with confusion, such a sweet country pearl as any prince might well have stooped to raise, she pleaded for us. Oh, 1,000 curses on that black fell shadow standing there behind her. The father, relenting, kissed the fair white forehead of that winsome girl. He bid Emmanuel bring at once a loving cup, and while that foul traitor reeled away to fetch it, he joined our hands and gave us, in tones of love and gentleness, his blessing. Then came back the scoundrel Spaniard, his lean, hungry face all drawn and puckered with his wicked passions, and in his hand a silver bowl of wine. O Jove, how cruel it flames within me now! My sweet maid took it, and, rueful for the pain she had given black Emmanuel, spoke fair and gentle, saying how we would ever stay his friends and do our best to prosper him. And even I, generous like a soldier, echoed her sweet words, telling that fell knave how, when the game was played and finished, e'en the worst rivals might meet once more in good comradeship. And so, while the mean Spanish hound, with cruel jaw dropped down and hands a-twitching at his side, turned from us, his tender mistress lifted the goblet to her lips and drank. She drank, and because she was no courtly goblet-kissing dame, she drank full and honest, then passed the troth-cup to me, and I laughed and swept aside my Phrygian beard, and happy once more and successful at the pink of my ambition, pledged those friendly two, pledged even yon black-hearted scoundrel scowling there in the shade, then poured all that sweet, rosy-tasting love-cup of promise down my thirsty throat. Gods! What was that at bottom of it? A pale, bitter white dreg? Oh, Jove, what was this? I dipped a finger in and tried it, while a dead hush fell upon us four. It was bitter, bitter as rue, cold, horrible, and biting. My fingers tightened slowly round the goblet stem. I looked at the sweet lady, and in a minute she was swaying to and fro in the pale light like a fair white column, and then her hands were pressed convulsive for a space upon her heart, while her knees trembled and her body shook, and then, all in an instant, she locked her fair fingers at arm's length above her head, and with a low wail of fear and anguish that shall haunt for ever that stony corridor, she staggered and dropped. Down went the goblet, and I caught her as she fell, and there she lay, heaving a moment in my arms, then looked up and smiled at me, smiled for one happy second her own dear smile of love and sunshine, then shut her eyes, trembling a little, and presently lay still and pale upon my bosom, dead. Fair, fair Elizabeth Faulkner! I held her thus a space, and it was so still you could hear the gentle draught of the curling smoke filtering up the chimney, and the merry twitter of the swallows perched far above upon it. I held her so a space, then kissed her fiercely and tender once upon her smooth forehead, and gave the white girl to her father. Then turned I to the steward, the bitter passion and the deadly drug surging together like molten lead within my veins. So turned I to him, and our eyes met, and for a moment we glared upon each other so still and grim that you could hear our hearts pulsing like iron hammers, and at every beat a long year of terror and shame seemed to flit across the ashy face of that coward Iberian. He withered and grew old, grew lean and haggard and pinched and bent in those few seconds I stared at him. Then, without taking an eye from his eyes, slowly my hand was outstretched and my sword was lifted from the anvil where I had thrown it. Slowly, slowly I drew the weapon from its sheath and raised it, and slowly that villain went back, staring grimly the while, like the dead man that he was, at the point. Then, on a sudden, he screamed like a rat in a gin, and turned and fled, and I was after him like the November wind after the dead leaves. And round the forge we ran, fear and bitter, bitter vengeance winging our heels. And round the anvil with its idle hammer and cold half-welded iron swept that savage race, round by where the pale father was bending over the soft dead form of his sweet country girl, round the ruined chaos of the great broken engine, round by the cobwebbed walls of that gloomy crypt, round by the clattering heaps of iron in a mad, wild frenzy we swept, and then the Spaniard fled to a little oaken wicket in the stony wall, leading by many score of winding steps far out into the turrets above. He tore the wicket open and plunged up that stony staircase, and I was on his heels. Up the clattering stairs we raced. Gods, how the fellow leapt and screamed! And so we came in a minute out into the air again, out onto old Adam Faulkner's ancient roof, out all among his gargoyles and corbie steps, with the pleasant summer wind wafting the blue smoke of luncheon time about us, and the courtyard flags far, far down below. And there I set my teeth and drew my sinews together, and wiped the cold sweat of death from off my forehead, and stilled the wild, strong tremors that were shaking my iron fabric, and, lost in a reckless lust of vengeance, crouched to the spring that should have ended that villain. He saw it, and back he went, step by step, screaming at every pace, hideous and shrill, back step by step, with no eyes but for me, back until he was unknowing at the very verge of the roof, back again another pace, and then, Jove, a reel and a stagger, and he was gone. And, as I rushed forward and looked down, I saw him strike upon the parapets 100 feet below, and bound into the air, and fall and strike again, and spin like a wheel, and be now feet up, and now head, and so, at last, crash with a dull, heavy thud, a horrid lifeless thing, on the distant stones of that quiet courtyard. It is over, and I in turn have time to laugh. I have come here to my secret den in the thickness of these great walls, staggering slowly here by dim steep stairs and rare trodden landings. Here to die. And I have double locked the oaken door, and shot the bolts, and pitched the key out of my one narrow window slit, and, gently rocking and swaying as the strong poison does its errand, I have thrown down my belt and sword, and opened my great volume once again. Misty the letters swim before me, and the strong pain ebbs and flows within. All the room is hazy and dim, and I grow weak and feeble, and my heavy head sags down upon the leaf I strive to finish. Some other time shall find that leaf and me a dusty ancient remnant. Some other hand shall turn these pages than those I meant them for. Some other eyes than theirs shall read and wonder and perhaps regret. And now I droop anon, and then start up, and the pale swinging haze seems taking shapes of friendliness and beauty. There are no longer limits to this narrow kingdom, and before my footstool sweep in soft procession all the shapes that I have known and loved. Electra comes, a pale proud shade, sweeping down that violent road, and holding out her ivory palm in queenly friendship. And Numidia trips behind her and nods and smiles. And there is stalwart Caius, his martial plumes brushing the sky. And earlier Sempronius, brave and gentle, and jolly Tullus, and two, a trooping band of ancient comrades. Now have I looked up once more and laughed, and here they come trooping again, those smiling shadows, and the fair Thane is with them, her plaited yellow hair gleaming upon her unruffled forehead, and by either hand she leads a rosebud babe, who stretch small palms towards and voiceless cries upon me. And white-bearded Senlac, and two, my Saxon serfs and franklins come gliding in. And there strides gallant Codrington, leading a pale shadow all in white, and Isobel turns a fair pale face upon me as she goes by. Oh, I am dead, dead, I know it, all but the hand which writes and the eyes that see, and I laugh as the last fitful flashes of the pain and life fly through the loosening fabric of my body. And now a hush has fallen on those silent shades, and their hazy ranks have fallen wide apart, and through them glides ruddy Blodwen. Blodwen, who comes to claim her own, and approaching, looks into my eyes, and all those stately shadows are waiting, two, for us two to head them hence. And she, my princess, my wife, has come near and touched my hand, and at that touch the mantle of life falls from me. Blodwen, I come, I come. End of chapter 24. End of the Wonderful Adventures of Phra the Phoenician, by Edwin Lester Arnold. Read by Phil Benson, in Sydney, Australia.